The snow had been falling since early afternoon, the kind that didn't rush but settled slowly, quietly, as if it had all the time in the world. By evening, the town felt muted, wrapped in white and silence. I stood by the window of my apartment, watching the streetlights glow softly through the snowfall, feeling that familiar ache I had learned to live with, loneliness that existed even when I wasn't alone. That my name is Ethan Miller. I had lived in this small mountain town in Colorado for almost 6 years, long enough for the winters to stop feeling romantic and start feeling endless. I shared the apartment with Daniel, my partner of 4 years. On paper, our life looked steady. We had routines, shared bills, polite conversations over dinner. But somewhere along the way, we had stopped really seeing each other. That evening, Daniel was working late again. I didn't resent him for it. At least, that's what I told myself. Still, the quiet of the apartment felt heavier than usual. I turned away from the window and checked my phone, more out of habit than expectation. That's when it rang. An unfamiliar number lit up the screen. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. But something about the timing, the stillness, made me answer. "Hello," I said. There was a pause on the other end, just long enough for me to think the call had dropped. "Ethan," a man's voice finally said, calm but unmistakably familiar. "It's Lucas." My breath caught before I could stop it. Lucas Reed was a name I hadn't spoken out loud in years, yet lived somewhere deep in my chest, untouched by time. We had known each other in our 20s, back when life felt more open, more uncertain. Back when feelings were easier to ignore and harder to understand. "I didn't know if you'd still have this number," he continued, his voice steady. "I hope it's okay that I called." It's fine," I replied, though my heart was already beating faster. Outside, the snow fell harder, as if the world was leaning in to listen. That we exchanged a few cautious words. "Where are you now? How long has it been?" Until he finally told me why he had called. He was staying in a cabin just outside town, a place he had rented for the winter. He said he'd seen my name mentioned online, connected to a local project, and on impulse, decided to reach out. "I was wondering," he said, almost casually, "if you'd like to come by. Just to talk. It's been a long time." I glanced toward the empty hallway that led to our bedroom, to the space Daniel would fill later that night. The invitation felt harmless on the surface. Just talking, just catching up. But the unease in my chest told me it wasn't that simple. "It's snowing pretty hard," I said, buying time. "I know," Lucas replied softly. "That's kind of why I called. It gets quiet out here. Thought you might understand." I did understand. Too well. After we hung up, I stood there for several minutes, phone still in my hand. I told myself I was overthinking it, that adults were allowed to reconnect, that I wasn't doing anything wrong. Still, as I pulled on my coat and boots, I avoided looking at the framed photo of Daniel and me on the shelf. The drive out of town was slow. Snow coated the road, blurring the familiar landscape into something almost unreal. The farther I went, the more isolated everything felt, as if I were leaving my life behind 1 mile at a time. That Lucas's cabin sat at the edge of a clearing, light spilling warmly from its windows. Smoke curled from the chimney, disappearing into the night. I parked the car and sat there for a moment, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. I didn't know then that this choice, this quiet decision made in the snow, would change the way I understood trust, love, and myself. All I knew was that I had answered a call I probably shouldn't have, and I was already standing at the door. Lucas opened the door almost immediately, as if he had been standing there waiting. Warm air rushed out to meet me, carrying the scent of wood smoke and something faintly familiar, like coffee or old books. For a brief second, we just looked at each other, both of us taking in the years that had passed. Thought he looked older, of course, but in a quiet, grounded way. His hair was shorter than I remembered, a little darker at the temples, and his face carried the calm of someone who had learned how to live with himself. He smiled, not wide or forced, just enough to soften his eyes. "You made it," he said. "I did," I replied, suddenly aware of how cold my hands were. He stepped aside to let me in, and the door closed behind me with a soft, final sound. The cabin was simple but warm, lit mostly by the fire crackling in the stone fireplace. A small lamp glowed in the corner, casting long shadows across wooden walls. Outside, the wind picked up, pushing snow against the windows like the world was trying to get inside. "Can I take your coat?" Lucas asked. I handed it to him, noticing how careful his movements were, how nothing about him felt rushed. He hung my coat by the door and gestured toward the living area. "Sit wherever you're comfortable." I chose the chair closest to the fire, letting the heat seep into me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't awkward, just heavy with things unsaid. "It's strange seeing you here," I finally said. "I didn't expect this call." "Neither did I, honestly," he replied, settling onto the couch across from me. "But when I thought about you, it felt unfinished, like a conversation we never had." His words landed carefully, not accusatory, not demanding. I nodded, staring into the flames. Back then, we had danced around honesty, both of us pretending friendship was enough. Life had moved on, but some feelings clearly hadn't. We talked for a long time, about work, about the town, about how different life looks when you're older than you thought you'd be by now. I told him about Daniel, about our routines, and the quiet distance that had grown between us. I didn't say everything, but I said more than I had said to anyone in a long time. Lucas listened without interrupting, without offering easy solutions. When he spoke, it was with care. "I get that," he said. "Being with someone doesn't always mean feeling seen." Those words settled deep in my chest. Outside, the snowstorm worsened. The wind howled low and constant, like a reminder that leaving wasn't an option anymore. "It's supposed to get worse overnight," Lucas mentioned after checking his phone. "Roads might close." I felt a flicker of hesitation. Staying wasn't what I had planned, but the thought of driving back through the storm felt impossible. "I can stay for a bit," I said, carefully choosing my words. He nodded. "Of course. There's no pressure." We moved closer to the fire, not touching, but aware of each other in a way that felt new and old at the same time. He poured us both a mug of coffee, and our fingers brushed briefly as he handed it to me. It was nothing, barely a moment, but it lingered as the hours passed. The conversation grew softer, more personal. We talked about fear, about the choices we never made. At one point, Lucas admitted that he had always wondered what might have happened if either of us had been braver. "I think I was scared," he said quietly. "Not of you, of what wanting you might mean." I didn't answer right away. The fire popped, sending sparks upward. I realized then how easy it would be to cross a line, how comforting it felt to be understood without having to explain myself. When I finally spoke, my voice was low. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with these feelings." Lucas met my eyes. "You don't have to do anything," he said. "Just acknowledge them." That night, I slept on the couch with a blanket Lucas handed me. We said good night without lingering, without promises. Still, as I lay there listening to the wind batter the cabin, I knew something had shifted. I hadn't done anything that felt obviously wrong, yet a quiet guilt had already begun to form, settling in like the snow outside, covering everything in sight. Morning arrived slowly, filtered through gray light and the steady hush of falling snow. For a moment, I forgot where I was. Then the scent of coffee and wood smoke reminded me. I sat up on the couch, the blanket still wrapped around my shoulders, and listened. The cabin was quiet except for the fire, which Lucas had clearly already tended to. I felt rested but uneasy, like waking from a dream that lingered too long. Lucas was at the small kitchen counter when I stepped into the room, moving quietly, almost thoughtfully, as if he didn't want to disturb the silence. He glanced over his shoulder and smiled when he saw me. "Morning," he said. "I hope you slept okay." "I did," I replied. And it was true. That was part of what made it complicated, that we shared breakfast at the small wooden table by the window. Outside, the world was completely white, trees bent under the weight of snow, the road invisible beneath it all. It felt like the cabin existed outside of time, separate from real life. As we talked, our voices stayed low, almost instinctively. There was no dramatic shift, no sudden confession, just a growing closeness that neither of us named. He asked about my childhood, about when I first realized who I was. I found myself answering honestly, more honestly than I had in years. At some point, I said, staring into my cup, You get used to choosing what's safe instead of what's true. Lucas didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was gentle. Safety can be quiet, but can also be lonely. The words settled between us. I knew he wasn't telling me to leave my relationship. He wasn't asking me for anything. That somehow made it harder. Later, the power flickered briefly, the lights dimming before returning. Lucas laughed softly. Winter out here likes to remind you who's in charge. We spent the afternoon near the fire, reading, talking in pieces. Sometimes there were long pauses, but they didn't feel empty. They felt full of things we were choosing not to say. At the T1 point, I stood by the window, watching the snow fall endlessly. Lucas came to stand beside me, close enough that I could feel his presence without touching him. Our shoulders almost brushed. I should head back once the road's clear, I said, more to myself than to him. I know, he replied. Whenever you're ready. There was understanding in his voice and something else, acceptance maybe, the kind that doesn't ask you to be anyone other than who you are in that moment. As the afternoon faded into early evening, the storm finally began to ease. The world outside grew quieter. I knew then that the pause this place had given me was ending. That I turned to him. I don't regret coming here, I said, but I don't know what it means. Lucas met my gaze steadily. Sometimes it just means you listen to yourself. For a second, everything felt balanced on the edge of something. I could see how easy it would be to stay, to let the quiet turn into something more. That realization scared me more than the storm had. That I stepped back, creating space between us. Lucas noticed and nodded, respecting the boundary without comment. When it was time to leave, he helped me with my coat. Our hands lingered for half a second longer than necessary, then separated. There was no dramatic goodbye, just a shared look that held too much history and too much possibility. The drive back felt longer than before. The snow had stopped, but the road ahead felt uncertain. As the town came back into view, so did the weight of what I hadn't done, and what I almost had. That I knew one thing for certain. Nothing had happened that anyone could point to and call a betrayal. And yet, deep down, I understood that something had shifted. I had crossed a line that didn't show on the surface, but I could feel it clearly now. When I pulled into the apartment parking lot, the lights were on. Dana was home. I sat in the car for a moment, breathing, preparing myself to step back into a life that suddenly felt different. The snow on the roof slid off in a soft rush as I opened the door. And as I walked inside, I realized the storm hadn't followed me home, but its silence had. The apartment felt warmer than I remembered, almost too warm, like it was trying to convince me that everything was normal. Daniel was in the kitchen when I walked in, sleeves rolled up, a quiet playlist humming in the background. He looked up and smiled, the familiar kind of smile that had once made everything feel easy. "You're back," he said. I was starting to wonder if the roads were still bad. "They were," I replied, setting my keys down a little too carefully. "But cleared up." He nodded, turning back to the stove. "I made soup. Thought it'd be good after a day like this." I thanked him and took off my coat, hanging it by the door. As I moved through the space, I noticed small things I usually ignored. The way the lamp cast a soft glow over the couch, the framed photo on the shelf, the life we had built without ever talking about how quiet it had become that we ate at the table together. The conversation was light, almost practiced. Daniel talked about work, about a meeting that ran late, about the snow slowing everything down. I listened, responding when I was supposed to, but my mind kept drifting back to the cabin, to the stillness I had felt there at 8T1 point. Daniel paused, studying me. "You seem far away." I looked up, caught off guard. "Just tired," I said quickly. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. He didn't push, but something in his expression shifted. After dinner, we sat on opposite ends of the couch, the space between us filled with unspoken questions. I realized how used we had become to that distance. That night, lying in bed beside him, sleep wouldn't come. Daniel's breathing was slow and steady, familiar. I stared at the ceiling, replaying moments from the cabin. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were honest in a way I hadn't allowed myself in years. The next morning, guilt settled in fully. Not sharp or overwhelming, but constant. I moved through the day distracted, answering messages late, losing track of time. Daniel noticed. Did something happen? He asked later that evening. Leaning against the counter, I hesitated. This was the moment where silence or truth would shape everything. I ran into someone, I said carefully. An old friend, his eyebrows lifted slightly. And we talked. A lot. Daniel studied my face, searching for something. Is that all? I nodded, even though my chest tightened. Yes. The lie sat between us, heavier than I expected. Daniel didn't accuse me, didn't raise his voice. He just nodded slowly, as if filing the information away. Over the next few days, the distance grew. Not because of what I had done, but because of what I was carrying. I found myself pulling away, guarding my thoughts, answering questions with half-truths. Daniel noticed the shift more than I wanted him. To point one evening, he finally said it. It feels like you're not here anymore. The words hit harder than any accusation could have. I am, I replied, but even as I said it, I wasn't sure it was true. We talked then, really talked for the first time in months, about how we had both stopped trying, how comfort had replaced curiosity. Daniel admitted he had felt me slipping away long before the snowstorm. I don't think you cheated, he said quietly. But I think something changed. I swallowed. He was right. That night, we agreed to take space. Not out of anger, but out of honesty. I moved into the guest room, carrying only what I needed. As I closed the door, I felt both relief and grief. That I realized then that emotional distance can be just as damaging as any visible betrayal. And once it's there, pretending it doesn't exist only makes it grow. The storm outside had passed days ago, but inside, I was still standing in the quiet aftermath, trying to understand what I had broken and whether it could ever be repaired. The days that followed were quieter than I expected. Not dramatic, not heavy with arguments, just slow and thoughtful, like everything had been turned down a notch. Daniel and I moved through the apartment carefully, speaking when necessary, giving each other space without needing to ask for it. The guest room became my temporary world, a place where I could sit with my thoughts without distraction, and I spent a lot of time reflecting on how easily I had answered that call, how quickly I'd stepped into a moment that felt comforting without considering the cost. It wasn't about Lucas alone. It was about how ready I'd been to feel understood by someone else. Point one evening, Daniel asked if we could talk. We sat at the table where we had shared so many quiet meals. There was no anger in his voice, only honesty. I don't think we're broken, he said, but I don't think we're the same either. I nodded. I don't want to hurt you. I should have been more honest before any of this. He looked at me for a long moment, then sighed. I know, and I should have noticed sooner that you weren't okay. There was relief in admitting that we had both played a part. No one raised their voice. No one placed all the blame on the other. Sometimes, love doesn't end in flames. Sometimes it just fades quietly that we decided to separate, not out of resentment, but out of respect. We needed time to grow individually, to understand what we truly wanted. Packing my things felt strange, like carefully closing a chapter one hadn't realized was ending that on my last night in the apartment. I sat by the window, watching the streetlights reflect off patches of melting snow. My phone buzzed. A message from Lucas. I hope you're okay. I've been thinking about you. I stared at the screen for a long time. Part of me wanted to reply, to step back into that calm understanding. But I knew now that I couldn't build something new without first standing on my own. That I didn't answer. Weeks passed. Winter softened into something gentler. I found a small place of my own, closer to the edge of town. Life settled into a new rhythm. I focused on work, on friendships I had neglected, on learning how to sit with myself without feeling empty. Sometimes I thought about the cabin, about the snow, about the moment that forced me to confront what I had been avoiding. I didn't regret it, not because it was easy, but because it taught me something important. That I learned that infidelity doesn't always begin with actions. Sometimes it begins with silence, with unmet needs left unspoken, with choosing comfort over honesty. Point one afternoon, while walking through the park, I realized I felt lighter. Not because everything was perfect, but because I was no longer pretending. I understood now that love requires presence, not just proximity. As the year moved forward, I carried the lesson with me. When I was ready to love again, I knew it would be with openness, with boundaries, and with the courage to speak before distance had a chance to grow. The snow that once felt endless had melted away, and in its place was something quieter, steadier, a sense of clarity I hadn't known I was missing.